Hello. Today's episode is with Vince Walsh. Vince has published 300 different articles on the human brain. He's worked with organisations such as Man United, England Rugby, countless high-performing businesses and military units. Today you'll learn about how we learn most effectively, the ideal size for groups to perform at a high level, and all of the brain training myths that go unchecked. This episode really is a cracker, if I may say so myself. Please enjoy. Okay, so podcast number 3, and we have the wonderful Vince Walsh joining us today. So Vince, welcome. Thank you for joining me. How are you doing?
Oh, everything's good, Ross. Thank you.
Amazing, good to hear it. So would you be able to just run us through who you are, what you're about?
How far back do you want to go?
Let's go back to from 18 forward.
Oh, okay. Well, at 18, I was a nurse, actually, which I did for 8 years. And then I went to university to do psychology, got completely hooked on the biological side of psychology, the more scientific side, and the physiology. Did a PhD in visual neuroscience, and from there went to do a postdoc in Oxford for 10 years, and then UCL, where I'm now Professor of Human Brain Research at UCL. But in the past decade or so, I've focused more on the application of the cognitive neuroscience in the real world. So it's things like working on principles of learning, which everybody thinks that they know or take for granted, but how do we make them really work in the real world, in the sports world, in the business world, and even in the educational world? We don't use them properly in the educational world, ironically. Working on creativity with groups, musicians and sports people, working on team dynamics, again with sports groups, military groups and business groups, and performance under pressure, again with all of those kinds of groups. And they all sound very different, but they're not. There's a core to them. And part of that core came out of my work on sleep. In sleep, we learn. We get ideas in an oscillatory state when the brain is firing at certain frequencies. And the same is true for getting into good states for learning and for making decisions. So it sounds like a wide span, but actually the scientific core is pretty tight.
Okay, that's really interesting. And one thing you said there, so you work with sports teams, military groups, and corporate.
Mm-hmm.
Are the challenges fairly similar across those groups?
Identical. In principle, identical, because what we've all got to do at the end of the day is perform at the very limit of our performance in whatever it is that we've mastered. And I keep the military to one side for a minute because there is a slight difference there. But whether you're trying to master a musical instrument, trying to master a subject so that you can talk about it and not know what you're going to be asked to talk about, so that you can learn a sport and perform that sport to the best of your ability with thousands of people distracting you, whether intentionally or not. That's all the same challenge. How do I deliver the very best of what I've got under challenging circumstances?
So with military, you put them to the side.
Yeah.
Why is that?
Just because you can, and I say this respectfully and wouldn't want to be misquoted, the military owns people in a way that a sports club or an employer doesn't, and that's one of the reasons for their success. And the other thing that they can do and monitor, because part of my respect for the military is that they know everything about psychology. They just haven't got the posh words for it. And I've learned as much from them as they've ever learned from me. But they can put people under repeated periods of stress, 2 terms of duty, 3 terms of duty in Iraq or Afghanistan or wherever it might be. So that is slightly different from the way it is in sport and business, mainly because you don't get a runners-up medal, you might die. And I think it makes a huge difference.
Yeah, the stakes are a little bit higher. I think you think about sport as well, and there is this element of ego that probably exists in the corporate world and in sport that doesn't. I'm talking out lack of knowledge here, but I assume less ego involved in military?
It's interesting. At the higher levels, there's a great premium on creativity and individuality, and I think that's necessary so that you can have the right kinds of organisation at the lower levels. Lower levels is the wrong word, even in the smaller groups, the smaller sections. Yeah.
Okay, interesting. Across all those three areas, one thing I'm quite interested in is this element of risk aversion or self-preservation within team environments. Is that something that is a constant problem across all three there, all four, including music?
Yeah, self-preservation. I wouldn't put it quite like that. But how do I keep my place in this team? How do I make an important contribution to this team? How do I, in some cases, stand out from this team? So there's in any team, or in most teams, there's a lot of competition. But where teams are well organised, and nowhere is it better than in the military, you get less of that within team competition. You get more coherence and more of a common purpose. And they've done it. They've done it in a way that psychology and cognitive neuroscience has rediscovered, but they've been doing it for hundreds and hundreds of years. So in almost every elite military unit in the world, the core unit is 4 people. And there's a reason for that. Some there's 5. 80% of the pop bands in the world top pop bands have got 3 or 4 people in them. There's some with 5. And any biological statement is like that. There'll be some outliers. But for the vast majority of the time, 4 is the stable number. And you only really get those damaging egotistical battles when the number gets to 6 and beyond. There's a good reason for it. There's lots of reasons for it. There are perceptual reasons. There are memory reasons. Next time you go to the shop for 5 things, I guarantee you'll forget one. Our working memory capacity is about 4 objects. And our ability to take in other events, other people, is limited to about 4 people. So what I think about what you said about what she did to him, I can cope with that. But what I think about what you said about what she did to him because of her, then it starts getting Shakespearean. And there's a limit on our conversational capacities. And one little parlor game you can play, or anybody can play, next time you're in a group situation, is just look at, and I do this with corporate groups when I go meet them, I'll arrive early and film them and then show them the film to themselves. And you'll see conversational groups of 6, 7, 5. And within a minute, and often much more quickly than a minute, it'll split up into a 3 and a 4, or a 4 and a 2, or a 3 and a 2. Because we just haven't got that capacity to take that 5th person into account. And so that's one reason, the memory reason. The other reason is what I call social capital. I should publish this before you show it to your thousands of followers. If I'm in a conversational group of 4 people, I can talk to person A, I can talk to person B, I can talk to person C. If you can talk to person A, you can talk to person B, and you can talk to me. So I'm in 3 2-person conversations, but I'm out of 3 2-person conversations. But that's okay, because for me to badmouth you, or you to badmouth me, or me to worry about you, it would demand something very bold, because it's a high capital risk of getting something wrong in a 4-person group. If you're in a 6-person group, now I can talk to each one of the other 5, but they can each talk to each other in groups of 2. So I'm now in 5 2-person conversations, and I'm out of 10 2-person conversations. So now I can think, and I'd have reason to think, what's Ross saying about me in those other 10 conversations, And you'd have reason to think, what's Vince saying about me in those 2-person conversations? So it's not hard to see why groups would fracture. And there's lots and lots of evidence for it. The best, as usual, comes from the military. I did ask somebody from an elite military unit once, why do you have 4 people in a group? Which has existed since Roman times, by the way. And he said, because if you've got 5 people in a group, you increase the chances of somebody coming back in a body bag, which kind of puts, scientific measures of milliseconds here and there.
Really?
Yeah.
So they said that. So is that just from their experience when we're in groups of 5, the chances of losing someone is higher?
Yeah. And
And
if
they
you
don't know why.
yes, and because you lose the control and cohesion, because it's harder to think what he did about what he did about he did. I've now got just one over my capacity. If you look at even sales figures, once you get more than 5 people in a sales team, adding a 6th or a 7th actually doesn't add value. They don't pro rata produce as much. But wherever you look, there's lots of evidence. And this has been just beautifully articulated by Robin Dunbar in his book, Grooming Gossip and the Evolution of Language, one of my top 10 pop science reads. And then there are other places where you can find it. Like, Haydn invented the string quartet and wrote 83 of them, but not a single string quintet. And even if you're into classical music, you can only think of a handful, if that, of quintets. And it's always an instrument visiting the quartet. Whereas with quartets, they last for decades and stick together. So there's a very good reason for any organisation or group of people on a project to not have a group of people larger than 4.
Yeah. And that was something, I remember when we first spoke about this, I actually think it was the first time I met you. I was waiting for a lift and we ended up speaking for about 45 minutes to an hour about teams of 4 and how that affects team dynamics. You mentioned something about a team of rowers where it's a classical
experiment in psychology, the Ringelmann effect. You put people on an erg machine, they're going to row as a team. Or it's been a tug of war as well, and just measure how much power people generate or how much they pull. And up to about 4 people, you get a reasonable amount of power from everybody. But when the 5th person is added, without anybody saying anything or even realizing it, the average power really, really sinks.
So it's a subconscious, almost. There's more people involved. My maximum involvement is less valuable.
Yeah, I think it's mostly subconscious, but there's always an asshole out there who's going to weigh up the odds.
Yeah. And is that because you have all these studies, and I'm probably really bad for this. I will hear a study that really proves the point I want to make clearly and repeat it without necessarily the knowledge of the origin of that study. Is that a little bit like Chinese whispers in pop science, especially, where the study is heard, it's passed on, it's slightly changed to make it fit a story.
Yeah.
And actually, it might have been a study of 3 people done once, not replicated, but...
Yeah, it makes me shudder. I think there are 2, I don't know where to throw my bombs first, at pop science or at podcasts. Which
you're part of it now.
Yeah, I know. I don't usually do them. I think this might be my 2nd ever. And the reason that I don't do them is that serious things have to be considered seriously, and the nature of a conversation is more off the cuff, and it always makes me very nervous because as a scientist you want to qualify things and not mislead people. But I spend a lot of time talking to people who say, "Oh, Vince, you're a neuroscientist. I've just heard this podcast which says," and almost without exception, it's that the podcast has said there is this one thing, and it might be this supplement, or so I can lose weight or get fitter. And what people fail to do often is put things into context. So maybe that supplement will help, but not if you're having 3 meals a day at McDonald's and you never go to the gym. There's never an easy answer, and I really worry about people looking for easy answers out there. And really, they're all in here, and in here, that's where the answers are. And the tough shit clause on life is that things require an effort. But if we understand what that effort is, then we can embrace it.
Yeah, and I think that does come to studies as well. Again, I'm probably guilty of this. If I'm looking to prove a point around a certain point, I'll search, and there will be a study. The same way that if you want to prove that a food is good or bad, there'll be an article that says it's good and an article that says it's bad. You can pick the one that you like.
Yeah.
And often the more controversial that goes against common understanding is the one that gets a bit more
Yeah.
headlines.
And I teach my students, I don't know if they learn it, but I tell it them, just don't have opinions about books that you haven't read. It's what are the fundamentals? So if we think about learning, I think is a great place to look for people's willingness to try and avoid making an effort. Will this supplement help me learn quicker? If I do brain training games, will my memory be improved? And the answer is no and no. The only thing that improves your memory is learning about something and giving yourself a context in which to put it. So brain training, I think, is a great one. There are companies out there now still selling brain gym products. And you do working memory games or other memory games or word games. Do they make you better at anything? Yes, they make you better at that game that's on and nothing else. There are no secrets. You just have to spend more time following the rules of learning on what it is that you want to become good at. And it's particularly pernicious in the neurosciences. So there's the brain training things, and people sell them to. One company was trying to sell them to a military group a few months ago. I'm very happy to say that I was given a chance to give my opinion. People sell them to sports companies. The EEG, brain measurements of electroactivity that Liverpool bought into for their penalty training a couple of years ago. Complete horseshit, and every serious scientist knows it's horseshit. What worries me is that I think sometimes the people who are selling these things know, or even worse, they don't care, or they don't know that they don't know. The more effortless the promise is, the more empty the promise is that people are trying to help you with. And if I can just add one more thing, the one of the things to be really careful about is the way people use the word brain and neuro. The neuroscience of marketing. There isn't one. There isn't one. The neuroscience of finance, the neuroscience of sales, the neuroscience of, and even the neuroscience of education. There isn't one. It's all about behavior. The brain is super interesting. Spent 35 years working on it, but the translation to the real world really lies in behavior.
Yeah, and I think so. There's one thing that comes out of it is that, unfortunately, like professional sport, neuroscience is something that people are interested in. Psychology, people are interested in it, like to have opinions, like to talk about it, which means the likelihood of getting poor opinions is high. In the same way in sport, people like sport, and everyone has an opinion on football, everyone has an opinion on the rugby team, which means uninformed opinions are more likely to come up. But there's something you mentioned about there is a value in people that can translate these complex things to people that don't have an idea. You said you once sat and saw someone give a really detailed talk on the brain, and it just didn't hit.
I did. I won't say who, because it's not fair. But I was sat in a corporate conference, and I was giving a talk on sleep at the time. And there was somebody speaking before me who is a consultant in behavior. And they were speaking very engagingly and very enthusiastically, and pointing at the area of the brain that was important for attention that she was talking about at the time. And I'm looking up at this slide, and the speaker was pointing at the parietal cortex. And I thought, well, I've published about 100 papers, minimum of 100 papers on the parietal cortex. I've stimulated it. I've put electrodes in it. I've recorded electrically from it. I've done brain imaging of it. And if there's one thing I know, it's not fucking bad. And I didn't know what to say, But instead of making a nuisance of myself, what I did was just ask people in the coffee break what they thought. And they said, "Oh, that was really, really interesting." But it was too intelligent for me. I didn't understand it. It's not your problem, It's the speaker's problem. So, and I just think there's an awful lot of that. I'll give you another example. A football club I was working with, somebody was trying to sell them an eye movement training program, and the idea is that the players would look at a spot on a screen, and then they'd saccade, move their eyes to look at targets, and their eye movements were measured. And when they saw the target, it would explode. The idea was what this would do would improve their attention to things in the periphery. I thought, well, first of all, the screen is there, 57 centimeters away. By the time the ball's 57 centimeters away, it's a bit late. But secondly, it falls into the brain gym or brain training fallacy, which is that what you do on a screen doesn't transfer to what you do. And thirdly, if you think about it from the fundamentals, what you're doing is giving people practice at moving their eyes very quickly to find targets. By that reckoning, every video game player should be the best footballer on earth, because they do thousands of hours of it. But it's bullshit.
Yeah, well, it was used in the 2003 World Cup preparation.
And it was
for
bullshit
rugby.
then.
So
And,
this one,
and that whole venture of eye movement training, ask anybody in eye movements.
is there any placebo effect that goes with it?
Sure, and if placebos work for you, I know the stakes are very high in sport, but then have the placebo. I mean, I'm not religious. Some players play for Jesus, or fight for Jesus, or sell for Jesus, whatever they do. I couldn't think of a better example of a placebo effect. In my view, if you believe something might work, but to bring a belief with you is one thing and acceptable. To impose a belief on other people is fraud.
So, and that's the interesting thing I found as a rugby player is sometimes if I had a good game, I would think, what did I eat that morning? What shoe did I put on first? What did I do the night before? It's probably the amount of training I've done over years and years honing my skill.
Yeah.
But for some reason, you get under this strange mindset of it must have been something else because I don't always play that well.
Yeah.
It must have been something. And even at the top level, people do that.
Yeah.
My teammates used to.
Yeah, and we all do. From little things like, right, for this seminar series, I'm going to crack a new notebook. And we've all got those notebooks that have got 3 pages in them. Then we brought another notebook for some other resolution. And we all do it by, again, a smaller example, but there are certain kind of uniforms or clothes that we think this is my kit for this kind of audience. And from there, we get onto some superstitious behaviours. And I think that's human and acceptable. And doing it on an individual basis, if it makes us more comfortable, then we are right. But pretending that you can sell something like this or implement something like this for a group of people, that's where it falls down. So if you ate 16 eggs and 4 sausages, and I've no doubt that you do, for breakfast, it would be a real mistake for me to do it. Yeah. Partly because I don't play rugby, but people waste a lot of time and money on things that don't work, and we know that they don't work. Brain training would be one of them, for example. It creates a culture where people are required to do things that we know has no effect. I don't mind outing another one.
Please.
Malcolm Gladwell's Blink. Malcolm Gladwell is a great writer. It's a bit like Ella Fitzgerald, she could sing the telephone directory and you'd listen. He could write about concrete, and he's such a beautiful writer. You'd listen. But if you look at the examples in Blink, they're all from or mostly, not all, from the area of social priming, and they're kind of really very sexy and make you think that there's something really deep in there. I'll just give you one example. If you get people to read a passage about something, and it's got lots of words about age and infirmity in it, and you get people to read other group of people to read a passage about something that's got lots of things about youth and vigor in it, and then you time how long it takes them to walk down the corridor to get their payment.
I think I've read that one.
Yeah.
Myself.
And lots of these areas, they're called social priming. They are part of what's called the replication crisis in social psychology. And it seems to be mostly in the domain of all these sexy things which have made it into the business world.
Which you can understand.
I can understand
why people
it.
jump
I
on
can
it,
understand
but-
it, and I don't blame the people who buy into it, and I don't blame Malcolm Gladwell for Blink, because at the time it was pre-crisis.
just to touch on that crisis where they found that about only 36% of this selection of, was it 1,000 studies were replicable?
And most of them were on social behaviours.
And that's something I've been woken up to quite a lot lately, is about a study, because often you hear people say a study showed, and that's as much reference as you get to any kind of go and look it up. It's by this. By the time it gets 10 people down the line, they don't even know who wrote the study. It's been changed. It's often on psychology students, and it's a sample of about 50 of them. It wasn't replicable, but it proves something interesting. Also, people are looking for data to prove what they were looking to find, as opposed to...
And that I understand as well. But it's just a pity that the real fundamentals, which are less sexy, it's as simple as that, haven't had the same impact. So I have a slide in one of my talks, which has got a series of books on front covers of books. I don't know, become fluent in 4 minutes a day, or just burn them, because what they all are a bastardization of the fundamentals. If I can take learning in psychology, the rules of learning are understood possibly better than anything else in psychology. We know exactly how to make perfect learning environments. And sadly, neither our schools nor our universities have got the courage to implement those learning environments. Part of the reason is that it's uncomfortable. So we put people in 2 hours of this and 2 hours of that and 2 hours of this. And yet we know that that's beyond anybody's learning capacity and consolidation capacity. By consolidation capacity, I mean the ability of the brain to embed it later on. And all our learning comes in our downtime. It comes when you're asleep. It comes when you're zoning out. You need downtime. So instead of having 2 hours of, let's say, physics, the kids would be much better off if we had 20 minutes of physics, 15 minutes of, I don't know how you'd control them for that 15 minutes, but not physics. 20 minutes of physics, 50 minutes of, again, I don't know how you control them, but 20 minutes. And then we get small pieces of learning and consolidation. And music teachers do this, fantastically well. They don't say, right, we're just going to spend 2 hours today until you can learn this piece of music. What they say is, let's do these 4 bars, and they'll stop you just before you feel like you're getting it. And that's a good thing as well. So learning isn't instant. It should be fractionated, spaced. You should have other things in between the sessions of learning, and it should be uncomfortable. One of the things I've always enjoyed telling my students is that your feelings don't matter in terms of learning. By that, I mean that our confidence in what we've learned is a very poor predictor of what we've learned.
Really?
There's even good evidence that it's a good idea to stop learning when you're around about 75 to 80% of the way there. But that's not how we want to learn. We just show me how to do this and I'll be able to do it. And we're afraid of doing it because if people don't feel happy with what they're learning, then they're going to complain. So it needs trust from the learner and from the instructor.
Is there a point on that? Again, this might be a self-hypothesis. I've always found if I'm reading a book or if I'm learning something, if I lose myself in the book, I remember it really well. If I'm reading out of duty, trying to get through to the next 10 pages, I tend not to remember it very well.
Well, if you get lost in a book or you get lost in a subject, the reason most likely is that you're already interested in that. And if you are, then your brain's, you've already, I caught myself there saying the brain when I meant you, you've already got a framework to put that in, So somebody might say to me sometimes, how do you remember so much about biology or neuroscience? And it's not that I remember lots of facts, it's that I've over the years got a framework for knowing where things fit. And you see this with experts in business, you see it with experts in sports coaches. They've got a context. When you're reading or doing something for duty, you're learning something new. that's exactly the time to be really keen on the basics of learning. I set myself a little challenge last year to give a lecture on a particular subject, which was way outside of my expertise. And the way I did it was by reading for 20 minutes a day on the subject. And the first couple of minutes, what I did was speak out loud, say to an imaginary audience what I learned the last 20 minutes. Then I'd read, and then I'd spend the last couple of minutes explaining what I think I'd learned this time. And that's another thing that we don't do when we're learning. We're always pouring things into people's heads, whether they be children or new employees. People learn when they get things out, when they do things. So when you've got duty to do, actually less is more. 2 20-minute sessions where you actually spend the beginning and end of them articulating what you think you've learned, even if it's wrong, it doesn't matter. It's better than sitting there with a book here, for your final accounting exams, whatever it is, and hoping that the gods of karma will somehow repay you for staring at a book without really concentrating.
Yeah, that's it. And that can be the writing down as well, or is it?
Writing down is really important. There's lots of evidence that if you write things down in a lecture, it's better than A, typing them, and B, it's better than recording them, partly because people don't really listen to the things that they record in lectures.
Yeah,
but even if you do, and it's another reason why podcasts are kind of very low yield. I don't listen to them. You just zone out, as people have already done while we've been talking.
We snap them back in, listen.
It's for the same reason that the reason to go to conferences and business meetings and scientific conferences isn't for the lectures. It's for the discussions at coffee time and lunchtime. It's for the people that you meet. So during the lectures, everybody is focused in one direction. And I can't talk to the person who's at the other side of the room. So there's no exchange of ideas. More than 90% of all your brain cells are connected to their next nearest neighbor. They mutter to each other. A very small percentage have long-range connections. And those are at a premium in activity during these oscillatory states, when you're asleep, when you're zoning out, when you're in the shower, when you're driving a familiar route and you can't remember it. That's when your brain cells are not all muttering to each other, but because you're out of their way in a way, you're not trying to use them, then long-range connections can make contact with each other and put bits of things together. And that's why you have this idea. When you're in a conference and you're muttering to the next nearest person, that's all you can do. But when you can meet that person who you've traveled to the conference to meet, that long-range connection, then you can really exchange an idea. But you don't get the ideas if you haven't put the stuff in. There's no such thing as a creative person. Anyone who you've met who's really at the top level of their game in terms of creativity, they never think they've got something sorted. The top musician practices their scales every day seriously because they do the fundamentals.
That's definitely an understanding that I saw from top level rugby players as well. It wasn't, I think what a lot of people would strive for was big moments that would make them, and then the people that did really well were obsessed with little moments accumulating. And it sounds simple, but it actually, I'm always amazed at how many people don't do it. They are looking for that big moment of the big goal, the big this, the fighting for the penalty, and actually the likelihood of getting these big moments is so much higher. When you're doing the day-to-day.
And that's my experience. Whenever I've met a game changer, they're always about details and fundamentals. My favorite example is Pablo Casals, the cellist, who rediscovered and made Bach's cello suites famous. A journalist went to interview him when I think he was 80, and he had to wait outside his studio, and he heard Casals practicing his scales, and when he came out, he said, "Can I ask you, Maestro, you're the most famous cellist in the world, why are you practicing your scales?" And he said, "Well, I think I can get better at them." And that's when you know somebody is the real deal. The bullshitters, on the other hand, are the ones who've got the big idea that's got nothing nothing behind it. There are people who have big ideas and there's a lot behind it, but it will be built on something.
Interesting one. Now, this isn't from the real world, but I always enjoy a Sherlock Holmes book.
Mm-hmm.
And there was a passage I read the other day, and he's done his thing where he analyses someone and he looks at them, he says, right, you're this, this, and this. And obviously, you can't do that in real life. But the person says, how on earth do you know that? That's amazing. And then he tells him, well, that tattoo can only really come from China. Also, that dirt is from this part of England. So, and he goes, oh, it's a bit easy when you know how it's done.
Yeah.
And he says something like, omne ignotum pro magnifico, which means everything that is unknown is grander.
Yeah.
And I think for a lot of people looking outside, they go, they see the big grand thing. When really, when you reveal what makes it, it's very boring.
Yeah,
you go into a top, you've seen this with sports teams. You go in thinking, what's the magical thing they're doing?
Yeah.
And they're not. They're doing simple things really well, day after day, and they fall in love with that boredom that creates the magical.
Yeah. It is. It's every game changer is a process-based person. I don't think there's any doubt about that.
That's an interesting area as well when it leads into going into sports teams, going into organisations. Now, you've worked with a lot of sports teams. For people listening, if you were to go into an organisation or team, what would you do to set that team up for success?
I wouldn't do anything. One of the things that I wouldn't go in thinking that I know what the solutions are. And I think one of the things that we often do is we see all the nuances and difficulties of our own efforts in our own world, but just imagine that things are a bit easier and less circumstantial for other people. In psychology, it's called the fundamental attribution error. People say sometimes, "Oh, football's just, kicking a bag of air about." Which one I'd like to kick that person about, because it's, we never say that playing the piano is just waggling your fingers about. There's snobbery behind it, which riles me. But I would ask them, first of all, what they expect of me. For example, one time I was asked to work with a young footballer who was on more per week than I'll ever earn in a year, and had a fantastic lifestyle. And we'd like you to help him to know that he's not made it and that there's work to do. And I just thought, this is too late in the day for me. And I can't do anything about that. So I would first of all ask them, what they think I can do, and then work out if I can do it within the context of how they already work. Because you can't go in and transform places. One example, a lot of schools start at 8 o'clock in the morning, 9 o'clock in the morning. The sports academies start at 8:30 in the morning. But we know that adolescents body clock shifts, and they really do need to be in bed later and up earlier. And we know that if you move school times to 10 or 10:30 or 11 o'clock in the morning, that teenagers do better in their exams, fewer disciplinary problems. They report that they're happier. Not that I care about their happiness in particular. Their attendance is better. Everything improves. So why don't we do that? We always say children are the most important thing in the next generation. So let's be serious. But we've got them going to school at times just because, well, we've always done it like that because of, frankly, factory times, And if lockdowns proved anything to us, it proved that we can change these things. In terms of learning, I think that's where I can do the most often for people. We know the rules of learning, as I said. It's spaced interleave learning, which means do shortish periods with breaks in between and do something else in between. What I see is drill after drill after drill after drill, and also drills not taken seriously. So I'll give you one example from a football club a long time ago. A routine where the person in the centre circle had to kick out somebody on the wing. The person ran down the wing. You carried on running to the penalty box, and then the cross comes in, and you get a one-on-one with the goalkeeper. And because I'm a scientist and you count things, I counted them. And 27% of the moves ended up with the goal going in, the ball going in the goal, which means that 73% didn't. But they thought it was a successful training because the focus was on the cross. But everything matters in learning. You know, your brain cells individually don't know that they're doing something wrong. If you do it wrong 73% of the time, they're going to get the message. And it's a little bit like, you know, a musician playing his scales would not think, I got the first 7 right, bollocks to the 8th, you know, I'll just, you know, I'll fluff it. It just wouldn't happen. So I think people often mistake action for learning, and they mistake repetition for learning. So those are 2 of the things. The third thing is to look at group cohesion. You know, I enjoyed a short while ago telling a group of football managers that I'm the only person in the room who knows what a team is. You know, they probably thought I was the only person who didn't know what a team was. Of course, in a context, they were right. But in another context, I was right. And the context in which I was right was this context of conversational groups. How do you get group cohesion? I'll give you one example of a team I worked with where 70% of the team were all from one source and 30% of the team were from another. And all that happened is that the 70% hung out with their friends. So the 30% didn't really gel with the rest of the team. You had a schism. And I went to the training ground. They had this kind of big wedding reception style tables in the restaurant, which meant that, you know, I'd be talking to somebody there and not the person there. The table was too big to talk to the person across the other side of the table. And it breaks that rule of a conversational rule of 4. What I got them to do was to set up the restaurant in tables of 4. And because, as I said earlier, there's high social capital, you can't opt out of a conversation of 4 people. And it was the noisiest dinner they'd ever had.
Yeah.
Because you can't opt out. You can't sit there, as we've all done in business meals and wedding receptions. We all sat there thinking, well, they're talking that way, they're talking that way, I'll go on my phone. Yeah. It's much, much harder to do in a group of 4.
And that translates, I assume, if you're setting up a project for a team and they're thinking, okay, let's go for a team of 6, would it be better to split the tasks up into 2 3s?
Very on doled out. Yeah, unless it was 6 people to carry a massive sheet of glass. Yeah. But for any long-term projects, groups of 3 and 4 are simply much more stable, going back to Robin Dunbar, conversationally and operationally.
Well, when we had a meal the other day as well, it was a really interesting example where you said, look at the table to the right, there's 10 people on that table. You will rarely see a conversation of 5 people, I think. There'll be 4s. Yeah. But if there is a 5, it won't last long. And we watched for a little bit. That's exactly and one person went off on their phone. Yeah. Or you did say there's one caveat, if there's someone of high status, they can maintain. Yeah.
So you'll often see at business meetings, you know, where people are trying to make contact, you might see one person of very high status speaking and the other 4, 5 or 6 people listening. But that's not a conversation, and that wouldn't be a sustainable group. When it's a group of peers or people who you want to sustain over time, then I would put 4 as that limit.
And you said you've already mentioned you're very much into your music as well, and that groups of larger than 4 usually become someone and or their likelihood of breaking up is high.
It's true, 90% more of the time. Fleetwood Mac described, I can't remember which one of them said it, but there were 5 people in the band, and somebody said everybody in the group got on with 3 of the other people. You know, I had two students recently do wonderful pieces of work. One was to look at 1,000 years of art, take 25 paintings from each century, and what she did was look at the proximity groups, how many people you get in bunches, and then look at the conversational groups, how many people you get facing each other or obviously in a conversation. And it doesn't matter, as in lots of art 1,000 years ago, whether Jesus is there or not. The groupings of conversational groups follows exactly the same distribution of the groupings of conversational groups in real life. The other student, so it's historically, it's not a modern phenomenon. And people say, well, given that we might be cleverer now, we're not, or there are more distractions now, I'm not sure there are, or that society is different, I'm not sure it is. Wouldn't it be different now? But so it's important to know, no, it isn't different now. It was always like that. Other students do analysis of 40 Asian movies and 40 Western movies, look at the conversational groupings, and also in sitcoms.
And we spoke about Friends, didn't we?
Yeah. Again, the distribution is there. And the beautiful thing about this is the artists didn't know they were doing it. They were doing this, obeying this social rule before they knew about perspective, before they knew about the rules of colour. Yeah. But they were getting the rules of social psychology, the rules of people, exactly right. That's how fundamental it is.
So that's one thing that's super applicable to someone listening who would go, all right, I've got a project.
Absolutely fundamental to how we put people in learning groups, how we put people on project groups, how we get people to invest in each other. And you can be a member of different groups of four and bring them together. Obviously bigger groups have to come together at some stage, but they have to be stable too.
It is funny how it does exist everywhere. It's not limited to performance or this or that. It's genuinely is quite consistent.
It's a fundamental of human behaviour and organisation, and always has been. Yeah. All the evidence is that from the very beginning of human societies, we've lived according to these rules.
And in military, and you did mention a few things about how military organisations recruit, about what they actually look for in some of these really elite teams.
They're looking for personality characteristics. I have never met an elite soldier who I'd call over affable.
Yeah.
And there are some organisations that like to put a quasi IQ bar of around about 115, and you might wonder why would you do that? And this comes to performance under pressure. And I think a lot of people have had the experience where, there's someone in your class and they might not be the smartest person in the class, but you put them onto into sports and they become somebody else. And there is good evidence that if you have a high working memory capacity, which correlates with IQ, that under pressure, you're less likely to perform at your peak or near your peak than someone who has a slightly lower capacity. There is that. And that's what training is for as well. Training is to help you to stop thinking about things under pressure. It's about execution under pressure. So if you've done those fundamentals, you will be thinking of those fundamentals. You don't want people thinking too much for themselves or too much out of the box in a really stressful situation. And that might sound as if it goes against creativity, but it's really in a constrained environment.
So developing performance under pressure is more about developing fundamentals so that when you are under pressure and you don't think, you do automatically.
And, just think of all those rugby games you've taken part in or watched, and somebody's made a mistake. Very rarely do you hear people say, "Oh, that was really worth getting wrong. That was worth the attempt." Sometimes it is. Somebody puts in a good cross, for example, or a good kick in rugby, and it's the other people who arguably are not on the ball. What you hear most of the time is, "I can't believe he's done that again. He's made the same mistake." And if we think about it honestly, we all do that. We all make the same mistakes over and over again. Or somebody might say to you, "Try not to do this today." And it's because we haven't practiced these things properly, fundamentally. And when we're practicing things, thinking purely about sport now, every single part of the action matters. So I'll give you one example. I was working with a tennis player who was changing her grip in some way or other. I mean, I didn't even need to know. because it's the principles of learning that count.
Yeah.
And the coach was counting, and he said, "Oh, she's done 35% of them right today, 35 out of 100." I said, "You stood there and watched her do it wrong 65% of the time. What's, there's a saying in brain science, cells that fire together wire together. So those brain cells don't know that they performed the wrong serve action. So, but they've done it twice as much as they did the right one almost. Yeah. So they wire together. So you're just learning how to do it incorrectly. But what I got them to do was, if the ball toss was wrong, blow a whistle, and then the rest of the action is stopped. If the cocking of the racket is wrong, blow a whistle, stop it. If, all right, this is hard for a gymnast to do, yeah, but there are lots and lots of areas of life where it's not hard to do this. Break it down. So in the same way as a music teacher does, we don't go on to that we don't put the 4 bars and 4 bars together until we can play each of those 4 bars correctly separately. Divide and conquer.
That's something that, as soon as you said that, there was a player, I won't mention, really talented fly half from rugby, who I've heard used to, if the pass to him on the first set piece wasn't perfect, he'd kick it back, do it again. Yeah. And essentially he might be doing what you're saying there. Yeah. I'm not going to allow that to be an acceptable part of our play. Once you've got that right, we'll move on to the next bit. Yeah. And actually, even though it might seem like he's a bit impatient and not easy to work with, what he's doing is training a much higher level of performance and better learning. Is that right?
Yeah. Because if you don't learn it correctly, then you'll have the devil's own job to learn how to do it correctly, because it requires you to unlearn what you've been doing. And that's why under pressure we often make the same mistake.
Yes, we spoke about Arsene Wenger, and you said he would often, when he was recruiting, look for things he didn't want as opposed to things that he wanted because of that exact
And
point.
I'm sure he's not the only expert in the world who would do that. That's what they do now. How do I get them to undo that? And it's a very intelligent thing to think.
Yeah, and I think we did speak a little bit about flow state, and you didn't seem to like the term flow, but there's this element of when sometimes you are just talking and everything is flowing out, you don't think about it, you're just on fire. When I was playing rugby, I definitely found that there was a few times in my career where I felt anything I did was going to go well. I didn't overthink it, I was just doing it. Now, I then tried to get back to that state, but you mentioned that's something you really should not do.
I mean, trying to get in those states is, again, it's one of those end goal objectives rather than a process. And I am a little bit resistant to flow. I think the original book by Cheap Mensi High, and that's one of the things, again, going back to don't have opinions about books that one hasn't read. I've had my time called on several times by people who just want to chat to me about the idea they've got about flow, but they haven't read the book end to end. But part of the reason for its appeal is it promises to make things feel easier, and B, it might be a shortcut, which Cheap Mensi High never promised. The only way to get there is by learning something deeply and intensely and being process oriented, and then you are more likely to get into the flow states. You can increase the probability by having your routines being better at ignoring distractions, focusing on the task rather than the consequences. There's one Olympic gold medalist, canoer, who top of the run in the 2012 final turned around to his partner and said, "This is the kind of problem we've always wanted," which I thought was beautiful. And that, then you can just get on with it because you want to do this. You're not worried about the consequences. But I am resistant to flow as a scientific concept. It's one of those. It's attractive because it's got so many degrees of freedom. I think the last one I read had 17 factors in flow. Nothing that is scientifically tractable has really got 17 factors. So I am resistant to it, but I recognise the phenomenon. And as someone who used to do a lot of rock climbing, I do understand it because half of the examples in the original book are from rock climbing. And I think gamers get into this state as well. You get into it when you're reading a great book and it's almost reading itself. I get into it when I'm practicing my trumpet. Things that make you lose track of time are the things that are more likely, but they're all things at which you're making an effort.
Yeah, I always found, for me, as I was a player, that if the first thing I did went well, the rest of the game would. And if the first thing I did went badly, the rest of the game would. And it was something that I tried really hard to control, but never really, if I'm being honest with myself, never really mastered that.
Yeah, it's, I mean, that perspective really matters. There was a wonderful lesson I learned a few years ago. There's this strange thing where if you look at the performance of footballers during Ramadan, the ones who are fasting, they do some of their best performances of the season. They run more kilometers, they complete more passes, they do better on all these measures. And it doesn't make any sense to me. Physiologically, you're compromised, your sleep is compromised, your diet's compromised. So I asked a really smart guy, I'd like to say his name, I won't, but I'd like to say his name because it's a compliment, but I never do. And I said, can you explain this to me? And he said, yeah. He said, when I go out onto the football pitch at 12:30 or 3 o'clock on a Saturday, if my legs feel heavy, I think, what's wrong with me? Have I got a cold? Am I going to have a bad game? Will I be able to if I go onto a pitch during Ramadan and I think my legs feel heavy, I think, of course they do. It's Ramadan. Yeah. If I wake up in the middle of the night, normally I think, what's wrong with my sleep pattern? Have I got a bug? Am I going to get back to sleep? Wake up in the middle of the night for Ramadan. I'm supposed to. I'm going to pray and eat and go back to sleep. Yeah. And he said, I've been doing it since I was 13. I know what the task is. I know what the challenge is. And he said he was doing it for his real badge, not his club badge. But it was really interesting to me that intentionally doing things which might be expected to compromise your athletic performance, he and clearly lots of others find a way of getting a benefit out of.
It takes away that expectation. Something that used to weigh on me all the time is it wasn't a fear of doing badly. Yeah. It was a fear of not doing my best. Not as in giving my best, so give your all. Yeah. It was like, I know what my potential is. Yeah. If I don't feel that, that's what scares me more. Yeah. And then
you're lucky in rugby though, and other sports, because there's enough going on around you. In rugby, there's 29 other people on the field. My favourite psychological sport for the pure torture element is tennis. But one, you've got nowhere to hide. It's just you and the other person. You can't blame someone else for where the ball went, on your team. Secondly, every 2 games, they give you 90 seconds to sit down and think about all the things you've done wrong. Wow. And at the start of the game, imagine a race like this. I mean, Monty Python couldn't have thought of it. Imagine a race that starts, right, go. How long is the race? Well, we don't know yet. Yeah. It might be 40 minutes. It might be 4 hours. Yeah. Could you imagine that?
Well, the worst one for me is actually a batsman in cricket. Yeah. I think that's the hardest thing because at least in tennis, if you lose the point, there's another point. Yeah. As long as you're still playing tennis, you can still win tennis. Yeah. A batsman. Yeah. They have the same waiting period between each ball.
That's a good point.
You have people around you trying to give you drip. It's hot usually. Yeah. And it is honestly I don't know whether they try and not think or think a lot.
Because I think even there they've got another advantage over tennis players. But there's another 12 people on the pitch in cricket, and I have to look out, where is that one? Why is he moving? Where is the bowler coming from? There's always something to do in cricket. In singles tennis, it's just you, and I love you for it.
But look, we've gone on for a while now. One thing I'd like to finish with, because we did speak about this, is if you were to recommend a few books around these areas that do teach the fundamentals and not to drive away, what they do.
I think for learning, and I will reiterate, we know all the fundamentals of learning in order to produce perfect learning environments. And we don't need to add neuroscience into the mix to make that better. I still think the neuroscience of learning is important for other reasons, scientifically, to understand it. But to make learning work in the real world, it's purely behavioral. And there's a wonderful book called Make It Stick. Make It Stick by Roediger and Brown. It's not got many pictures in it, but it's not a textbook either. But that's got all the rules. And I think if you were to read one and only one book on learning, I would make it that one.
Make It Stick.
On sleep, I know it's been criticised for some overstatements and claims made in it, but I would defend the book and the scientist Matthews Walker. Why We Sleep is a real service to the community, and it's easy for some people to criticise the odd thing here and there about the book, but to do what he's done in that sweep is intellectually very impressive. That would be the one book on sleep and learning. And for group dynamics, Grooming, Gossip and the Evolution of Language is one of the best pop science books ever.
Okay,
and I've read almost all of them, I promise you.
And on that one, right before we finish, pop science myths that you'd like to dispel?
There are some. Well, gym training is one. Neuro something is another. The neuroscience of, just be very careful. Learning styles, horseshit. We all know that there isn't an auditory style and a visual style and a kinesthetic. There isn't. People might say, well, I feel as if I learn better when, but all the evidence is against it. When actually you do better when you feel uncomfortable.
The learning style is surprising. I thought there were people respond better to different learning styles, but people learn on the whole in the same way.
Not on the whole. Learning is about spaced, interleaved, properly rewarded iterations, and we might feel that we like some foods more than others. They might not be the best foods for us. Yeah. We might feel that we like some ways of doing things more than others.
You hear people say a lot, I like to learn in this way. That's not quite how I learn. That's the myth.
Yeah.
Okay, interesting. Well, look, amazing. I really, really appreciate your time, Vince.
You're welcome.
Been really, there's so much packed in there for people to dive into. So thanks for your time. And
super.
We'll catch up soon.
Thank you.
So there we have it. End of episode 5 with my 4th guest, Vince Walsh. I really do appreciate you taking the time to listen all the way through to the end and enjoy the rest of your day. Bye-bye.